presenters of today is Pam. She will specifically talk about communication and the do's and don'ts of patient-researcher collaboration. And I will start off in the first half hour with focusing on the OMERACT recommendations for working groups. This webinar is actually the second one in a group of webinars. So the second webinar, following the first one that we had in November, some of you did attend that webinar, and then we explained a little bit more about what OMERACT is, where it stands for, and we focus specifically on the development of a core outcome set. So what would we like to do today? I think first of all, share some experiences of us regarding the integration of patient research partners into working groups. We would also like to raise awareness about the OMERACT recommendations that has been published in 2014, and then finally speak a little bit more on the do's and don'ts in communication. I think it's important to note that participation in these webinars does not imply participation at the OMERACT meeting in 2018. Just to recall what we discussed last time, and I think this is important because we need to remind ourselves, but also the researchers with whom we are working, what exactly is meant by patient research partners. And we have defined this as a person with a relevant disease who operate as active research team members on an equal basis with professional researchers, adding the benefit of their experiential knowledge to any phase of the project. So there are quite a lot of characteristics of a patient research partners, and during this webinar we will also highlight the relevance of some of these characteristics. Not all researchers, whether it is in OMERACT or outside, are really aware of the function and definition of a patient research partner. So there is still some work for us to educate and introduce this concept to new researchers who are not familiar with this concept. Last time we also highlighted why it is important that patient research partners are involved in research, and specifically in OMERACT, it is the only way to ensure that core outcome sets do really reflect the domains and the instruments that are important for patients. And most often these are related to what we have called health-related quality of life. If you go back in the early days and look at the first core outcome sets, you will see that they are mainly have a main physical focus, while the newer outcome sets where patients are involved also include more life impact measures. So domains that reflect impact of the disease rather than only the signs and symptoms. And I think that's a direct result of having patients involved in the work. What is expected from you as an OMERACT patient research partner? Well, first of all, as I just explained, help researchers to identify outcomes that are important to patients and to select adequate measurement instruments or tools that are able to measure that specific domain. It also means an all-in partnership with all the team members on the principle of equality. And equality is easier said than done. And I think this is something that is still often not a reality. So we expect that patient research partners should be an equal partner on the team, but looking at the behavior of team members or on outcomes of the work of a working group, it's regularly not that patient research partners are equal to other members. And just to give an example of that, that's also something that I've experienced myself. Being on a working group and not being invited for a particular meeting. Sometimes also where a researcher has decided to send not all the information also to the patient research partners. So that means that if a researcher starts selecting information that he or she think is relevant for patients, introduces already some kind of inequality. And I think we have to be always careful and alert that we are dealt with in the same manner as other team members. The third bullet points is about participation, meaning that this is not based on patient advocacy or promoting access to treatment. We as patient research partners should really try to be promoting the conduct of relevant and high quality research, which means that we should always step in a project or a working group with an open mind. We have to have an open mind to the data that will come out of the project, and analyze the data, interpret the data without a preconceived expectations what our findings should prove or not. And therefore, I think it's important to realize that we are not there with a personal agenda or with a specific patient advocacy role, but like all other researchers, try to be as open as possible. And finally, I think we are also expected not only to provide input on research on our own disease, but also when there is discussions about other rheumatic diseases, what we could add to that work. And I think there are still some overarching principles and input that we as patients that are quite general for patients and that could also be beneficial for other projects. Are there any questions so far?
Nope.
No? Okay, then I would like to continue and introduce the recommendations for involvement of patient research partners in working groups. These recommendations has been developed by the patient leadership team in collaboration also with researchers in OMERACT. And the work that we have been doing to develop these recommendations were brought to the OMERACT conference in 2014 and finally approved by the entire OMERACT community. They consist of 3 overarching principles and 8 recommendations, and I would like to briefly go over each of them. First of all, OMERACT values the experiential knowledge of patient research partners as critical to outcome research. And this is not something like just a slogan. It's really the opinion of the entire executive committee of OMERACT that you cannot do outcome research without direct involvement of patient research partners. And I think this is one of the learnings from 2002 onwards, that if you want to do outcome research and develop patient-reported outcomes or develop core outcome sets, engaging patients under B, patients as research partners should be an integral part of each project. And this involvement should be throughout the research process. And this is really a fundamental principle of OMERACT. And of course, the level of involvement may vary. Just to give an example, there are sometimes projects that focus on imaging, that could be ultrasound or MRI, or on a very specific methodology, such as rush analysis. And for that research, it is legitimate to have a little bit more limited patient involvement. And then under C, OMERACT has formulated some general basic rules of communication, you could say. And we have summarized them in the terms trust, respect, transparency, partnerships, communication, diversity, confidentiality, and co-learning. And co-learning really also reflects the principle of OMERACT that all the work that we are doing follows an iterative research design. So nothing is set in stone. Findings are never final. It's an ongoing journey in all the things that we are doing. And that's also the case for core outcome sets, that in the future they might also need to be updated if new information becomes available. Are there any questions about the overarching principles? Okay, then I would like to continue and go over the 8 recommendations. First of all, the working group leadership should take responsibility for appropriate representation of the patient perspective in the research project. The patient perspective can be involved in every project through different methods. One method could be to include the patient perspective in the methods that the working group proposes to collect data. You could think about interviews, organizing focus group, looking at the literature, what is already written and studied on the patient perspective about a particular condition, or also organizing the Delphi surveys. This is one way to include the patient perspective in the research. But OMERACT also expect that working groups involve patients directly in the design and conduct of the studies. So it is by combining these 2 different methods that appropriate representation is achieved. But achieving this representation is not a responsibility that only lays on the shoulders of the patients or the patient research partner, but is really a shared responsibility of the entire research team. Recommendation 2 says that each working group should involve at least 2 patient research partners. And an exception is allowed for those research projects that I mentioned earlier, which is, for instance, on imaging or on biostatistical challenges. There is some strong evidence that this recommendation is valid, and I think there are also good reasons that you could imagine yourself being not on your own in a project. In case of if one of the patient research partners is ill, it does not automatically mean that the working group is without the patient perspective. Patients can prepare a meeting. They could be sparring partners in advance of a project. And of course, it's also fun doing research together with a fellow patient. 3, patient research partners should be identified based on experiential knowledge of the research topic, also taking into account a particular interest in the topic, language skills, and access to the internet. And you will notice that it doesn't say anything about education or a specific level of scientific knowledge. This means that it's really about experiential knowledge, having daily experience with living with a particular condition, which should be sufficient to be a member of a working group. Language skills, of course, refers to being able to speak and read and write English. Access to the internet is important to communicate with researchers, and of course it's also helpful if you have communication skills and being able to present a patient perspective in a working group. And we will come back to that later. The 4th recommendation says that patient research partners and the working group leadership should discuss the goal of the project and mutual expectations. It doesn't say, but actually we all know that this is something that should really take place right at the start of a new project. And we also have learned that this is not always the case. So patient research partners sometimes are appointed to be partner in a project, and sometimes a project starts or it sits in the heads of the researchers, but the actual rules and arrangements for collaboration are not exchanged between the patients and the researchers. And this might also cause sometimes tensions or sometimes even frustration. We recommend, therefore, that it's always beneficial, if possible, if you are part of a working group, really to ask the working group leader to have a separate call, a telecall or a Skype meeting before the first meeting of the project team. Recommendation 5, patient research partners should be given the opportunity to be involved throughout the research process. The level and timing of involvement may be adapted according to the scope and type of the project. This is also very important and something that you also yourself should keep an eye on. It's easier also for researchers to involve patients at the start of a project, but then sometimes your involvement is forgotten by the researcher, often not really on purpose, but things like this happen. And it's a principle of OMERACT that we say it's not only a matter of involvement at the start of the project, because there's always this scientific process where the patient perspective can be lost during the further development of a project. So you really need the patient research partners to guard or safeguard that the patient perspective is not lost along the way, and that it's really meaningfully integrated in the work till the final end of the project. I think
Excuse me, Martin.
Yes?
May I interrupt here? Yeah, there's an issue with the steering group versus the working group, and I just had a situation with the adherence group. I looked at her plan in the paper. I think I'm hearing an echo, so I'll just put this on. Does that help? Just a minute.
Yeah, and maybe you can introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
It's Ina.
Yeah.
And I'm now using earphones. Okay. But you look at the plan for the project, and they basically have put patients into a steering group, and then the rest of the working group, well, if you're going to OMERACT, you're fine. But if you aren't, you basically have no more involvement, because you won't have known the discussion at OMERACT or anything along that line. So it's almost better to say to the patient, we have no more need for you, than to hang on to them, and then they're just sort of, it's a make work project that is being created with a telephone call. That's not, I mean, it's very difficult to find satisfactory involvement as a volunteer if you are part of it, but then you're not part of it. Do you understand that? Well, I guess you do. You see it in recommendation 5. It's involved throughout the research process.
Yeah.
That's enough.
I think you are absolutely right, Ina, and correct that sometimes now within working groups, they make this distinction between steering group and working group without actually defining what the role is of the different groups, but also what the level of involvement of patients is and what the responsibility of the different groups is. And I think this is something that the patient research partners should really be alert for and discuss with the working group leader. And then I look a little bit at number 4, right at the start. What do you exactly expect from us, and how are we going to communicate regularly during the project? And to make arrangements exactly for the reasons that you mentioned, to avoid that it's only a token having patients at the start of the project and then without any follow-up later on. So I think you clearly illustrate the risks if you haven't made this kind of arrangements at the start of the project. And we could always learn better by this type of experiences. Yeah. So thanks for that, Ina.
Right.
Okay.
Can I just add something to that, Martin?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. In my experience, I think Ina alluded to this. There are times when you might have 2 patients who work on the working group, but there are other patients who are involved in the project as well. So, for example, when we were involved with the RAID, there were a lot of patients from around Europe, but we went all on the main working group, as you and another patient were. So those of us who were not on the main working group, we fed in to the project. There were quite a few of us, but we couldn't all be on the main working group. Otherwise, it's far too unwieldy. So there will be times when, as a patient, I'm not involved in the working group, but I am one of the patients who's involved in other ways. And the same goes for researchers, clinicians and researchers. You might have quite a number of them who are involved in the project, but don't sit on the steering group, the main working group anyway. They're not the lead researchers. So those of us who are not on the main working group, we take a back seat until our input is required again. But we will not be there throughout the whole research project, and we may probably not be on co-author on the papers or anything like that, because otherwise it's just too big a group to manage. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes sense to me in that sense, but I think from the point of view of keeping patient research partners motivated to be part of and equal in the research team, I think there is a problem. And I think because there's lots of choice, this is all volunteer work, and there's lots of choice for involvement. I don't know. It's something that, as I said, to just sort of be on the outside and then not know anything that's happened, especially in a face-to-face meeting, all that kind of stuff. You might as well just say at the start that should be clear. Then the person can say, well, I think I'll just give that a miss.
I think you're right. If it's a face-to-face meeting, I think you're right, Lena. You need to be brought up to date on what's gone on behind the scenes with the other patients. So as long as there are patients on the main group, which might not be me, it might not be you, but there are patients there, when you then have another face-to-face meeting or even a conference call, all of those involved need to be brought up to date because they've not been involved in the background work. So yes, you're correct. It would be quite difficult to contribute to a session, whether it's face-to-face or a conference call, if you're not given all of the information about what's gone on so far. Yeah, because
any comments you might make might be totally irrelevant, and then you think, oh, gee, what's
that's right. Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
I think, Pam, you will also come back to this, what you can do if you, for a longer period, don't hear anything from the project leader.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think that was very helpful to understand why the involvement throughout the research process is important, but also that there is something that we have to accept, that as long as it is agreed at the start that the level of involvement may be different for different types of roles in a project. I would like to continue with recommendation 6. The working group leadership should provide the patient research partners with timely and tailored support and information. And you could think about access to Dropbox files, literature, papers, lay summaries of ongoing research when they are available, and of course also support by being included on teleconferences. And that's also very important to optimize participation and collaboration throughout the research project. Within OMERACT, we have an extensive set of means to provide support and information. Already at the early start of patient involvement, and that's also how Pam and I got involved, we both developed the glossary, first of all for the patient research partners, as a source for understanding difficult terms often used in scientific research. So all the abbreviations, all the methodology, but also rheumatology, more the medical terminology. We have tried to make a list with a summary of the terms in lay language. And this glossary is also available for you. You can find it on the OMERACT website. And we will also, after this call, share the glossary from 2016 with you. The glossary will be updated next year in the first half, but I think it's an helpful document if you are looking for specific information. And this is just one example for providing support. This is support that patients provide to other patients, but of course we also expect that within a research team, the researchers will also be responsible for providing adequate support to the patient research partners by introducing them at face-to-face meetings or in a telecall, just by asking questions, invite patients to provide the patient perspective and things like this. Recommendation 7 says that the nature of patient research partner involvement should be reported throughout the OMERACT process, and at least in the initial research proposal and the final reports. We should always be aware that researchers, specifically new researchers, are not very familiar with how to report patient involvement in their project. They have not been educated in this, and they really can use also the help of patient research partners to make explicit what the role of patients in a project could be at the start, but also at the end, describing what has been the role and what has been the input of patients, and with the input also the impact of patient involvement in the project. Researchers are not very good in writing this type of outcomes, and I think we could learn a lot if researchers would be stimulated to better describe what has been the added value of patients in a project. And now this is often lacking if you look at the final publications. So I think this is also something that we could look at when we review final articles of a project, for which some of the articles we will be co-authors, and therefore we could also give some suggestions how this could be written down. The last recommendation is about how the input of patient research partners could be recognized appropriately. I already mentioned the being a co-author of a publication, although this is not important for everyone. But recognition could also be in the form of given an opportunity to be a co-chair of a session, by giving a presentation at a plenary session, or in any other way. So I think these were the 8 recommendations. Are there any questions so far? If not, then I would like to ask Pam to introduce herself and to say a few more about the communication and the do's and don'ts.
Thanks, Martin. So yes, as I said earlier, I'm Pam Richards from Bristol in the UK. And if you look on a map of the UK, it's basically a straight line going west from London by 2 hours to London from Bristol. So if you know where London is, I'm just 2 hours to the west. It's a lovely city if you ever have the opportunity to visit, so I would highly recommend that. So looking at specifically an OMERACT working group, as a bit of background, my involvement as a research partner has been mostly with the university. There's 2 universities in Bristol. Most of my research activity is with the two universities in Bristol, and quite a number of other organisations. And a part of my working in research as a patient research partner is also with OMERACT. Majority of work for OMERACT and the research that goes on is not actually at an OMERACT conference itself, but it's in the intervening time. So if you are involved in research for OMERACT, you may never get to a conference, but actually the best part of the research, the part that makes a big difference to our lives as patients, is what happens outside of an OMERACT conference. So at the moment I'm involved in quite a number of research projects, and a couple of them are for OMERACT. So I sit on 2 OMERACT working groups, one of them with Marika, and that one, I'll talk a little bit about it in a minute. But each working group for OMERACT should comprise of 3 co-chairs who represent 3 different continents, so that we have good representation globally. There should be at least 2 patient research partners on the working group, but as we were discussing before with Ina, there can actually be a lot of other patient research partners who are involved in that particular project, but are not sitting on the working group as well. If you can imagine, if you had 10 patient research partners and 3 co-chairs and 2 fellows, etc., it would be too much of an imbalance for the patients. So we should be representative, but not take over. Remember also that we are not researchers. My background was actually in banking as a bank manager, and I had no involvement at all in research. It could be that somebody is a patient as a research partner who is also a researcher. That can happen. But actually our job as research partners is not to add to the body of research, but to add our experience, add our daily lived knowledge, and not to try to take over and tell the researchers what their job should be. On every project as well, there should be at least 1 fellow. In one of mine, there are 3 fellows, and the fellows are great because they're at the start of their research career, and as patients we have an influence for those fellows as they start their research. We can help them to appreciate how effective it is to have the perspective of patients, and to then ensure that all of the projects they take on in the future always involve patients who give the lived experience that they have. And so we can work really well with fellows as well as the other team members. And I've been involved as a research partner now for 18 years. And over that time, it started where it was actually quite difficult to get some of the researchers to want to engage with patients. But in a short space of time, they saw the benefit, they saw the value, and they quickly took on the ethos of having patients involved at every area of research. There's no one model for involvement, and there's no one level of involvement, except to say there should be involvement throughout the process, throughout the research. But what I do on one project, I may not do on another. So I might chair a meeting or co-write an article or present at a conference for a project, but on another project, I'm simply giving my opinions in telephone calls and then responding to emails. So not every research project works in the same way, except to say that the perspective of the patient has to be at the heart of what goes on. Dropbox, I don't know, I'm assuming many of you know about Dropbox. Personally, I don't like Dropbox, and I find it a bit unwieldy. Having said that, it is one of the main tools that researchers use these days to share the data and the files and any documents that they produced. So if you can download Dropbox when you start a project, ask the principal investigator to ensure that you are given access to the Dropbox, and they have to then add your email address, which gives you permission to look at Dropbox. And if you have it on your computer, it'll often come up and say that somebody has amended some of the files in that particular project. And so if you're involved in a number of projects, the files will be there for the different projects. If it becomes too much and there are just too many files, then you will probably have to say to the principal investigator or to the fellows, can you please just give me a summary of what has been changed or what's happened since the last telephone conference or since the last meeting? Because for us, it can be too much. Other times, it's really helpful. Research takes time. It takes a lot of time sometimes. It can take weeks or months when the fellows in the background will be doing a lot of their work and they're feeding back to the principal investigator. They're getting advice from the investigators, but we may not hear anything, and other members of the team may not hear anything. So one of the projects I'm on at the moment, it's been, I think, about 4 months since I've heard anything. And I was beginning to think that maybe my email address has been missed off the round robins of emails and inviting into telephone conferences. So this last week, I contacted one of the researchers who is also on the project, a clinician, and I asked if she'd heard anything, and she said no, there hasn't been any other telephone conferences since the one I'd been involved in. There is work going on in the background, and that she expects that we'll hear something soon. So that just set my mind at rest that I hadn't missed something, or I hadn't missed an email that I should have read, and that I will continue to be involved when another meeting is set up. So be patient, but be proactive as well. Don't always assume that nothing is happening. If you don't hear for a while, just send a gentle reminder email and say, can you just bring me up to date with what's going on and when the next call might be? I've not heard anything. And then somebody will get back to you. So always contact either the principal investigator, or if your contact is one of the fellows, then the fellow. So really good communication. It starts with being prepared. When you have a telephone conference or a face-to-face meeting, if you go in to the meeting and you haven't done a bit of preparation beforehand, then you probably won't remember what was said in the telephone conference or at the meeting 2 months ago. The other researchers, they're dealing with this every day. This is their full-time work. It's not just that project, it's lots of other projects. I'm fairly fresh. We've got on with our lives. We're doing other stuff. We might be involved in other projects or other work or our own normal life. And then we come to this meeting. We have to be prepared and ready. Every time, otherwise we'll be completely lost in the meeting and we won't know what to say or how to contribute. We haven't noted any questions that might be relevant for us to raise. So just take a bit of time to review past emails. I keep a file of all my projects on my email, and each project has its own file, and I put all of my emails related to that project in those particular files. So you'll have your own methods, but you have to be a little bit organized in order to be prepared. Listen, obviously, you want people to listen to you, and you also have to listen to what other people are saying, and take into account that you're coming from different perspectives. Be friendly, Don't come in with the, I'm going to tell them exactly what's going on and how they're doing it all wrong. That isn't going to, it isn't going to help communication. So be friendly, certainly be confident. Even if every single other person on the call is a professor, that doesn't matter. They don't have the experience that you've got, and they can't recreate the experience you've got unless you tell them what it's like to wake up every morning with your condition, etc. But speak with respect, and also there'll be other people on there who might be struggling with the project too, may not know where they're coming from. Then you're not always the only one who is new to a project. Sometimes the researchers need a bit of help as well. And researchers, some of them haven't engaged with patients before, so they can actually feel a bit nervous. And we don't want them to be too nervous of us, because we don't want to be nervous of them. So OMERACT in particular and other projects is all about gaining consensus about what the way forward. And you don't want to be a stumbling block in that consensus-driven agreement. You want to be able to make your opinion known, your perspective known, but not to be obstructive. So clarify what you've got to say, be motivating instead of being dismissive, be positive. The next bit is provide suggestions how research can be improved, and complement the group, not as in saying something nice about somebody, but as in completing the group. We are there to complete the group. We are complementary to the rest of the group. When I say about provide suggestions for how research can be improved, one of the best comments, which was a bit of a throwaway comment by a professor on one of the professors I did a lot of work with, he once said, I'd said something in a project and he picked up what I said and he used that comment in a different way almost. He was able to interpret what I was saying. It wasn't sort of very knowledgeable, it wasn't very wise, it wasn't very clever. It was just a comment about what I was experiencing. And he used that comment in order to improve the research. And that was his job, to listen to what I had to say and then to take out from what I was saying the bits that were really relevant. And that took a lot of the pressure off me from trying to be clever, because I thought, I don't know anything about this. What can I possibly contribute? And I realized that actually it's my perspective, that's my contribution. And he can work with that, and the other researchers can take from my comments what is really important. A very clear-cut example of this particular point is in the area of fatigue and rheumatoid arthritis, and rheumatoid arthritis is my main condition. In the very early days, going back to 2002, 2003, when fatigue hadn't been taken seriously, a group of researchers got together because of a comment that was made at OMERACT, and they decided to look at fatigue in people with rheumatoid arthritis. A person called Karen was on that project group, and she was a patient with rheumatoid arthritis. And she said, I almost didn't say anything, but everybody was chatting away about people who were in a flare and experiencing fatigue. And then she just thought, no, I'll say it anyway. And she asked, why are you only talking about patients who are in a flare, who are experiencing fatigue? And the researcher said, well, but because they're the only ones who would have fatigue. If you're not in a flare, you don't have fatigue. And she said, that's not true. I experience fatigue even when I'm not in a flare. And that comment from her completely changed how the research was conducted, because if she'd not made that comment, a whole body of people would have been missed out on the research, and that was all the people who were not in a flare. So her comment that she almost didn't say actually made a vast difference to the way as patients with rheumatoid arthritis and other rheumatic conditions now are helped in the area of fatigue and And I'm really grateful for Karen for speaking up in that way. Be aware of other different agendas. If you're on a project, particularly say with pharmaceutical companies, I tend not to be on projects with pharmaceutical companies, but it can be. They have their own agenda for what they want the patients to do and to say. Pharmaceutical companies are fantastic, and without them, we wouldn't have the drugs that we have. But they're also salespeople, some of them, and you just have to be aware of that. You might have patients as well who they're mostly advocates, and they can't see the difference between being a research partner and being an advocate, and they might want you to come along with their opinion as advocates. And again, they've got agendas. So always be aware. You might have a professor on a research project who really wants you to agree with him or her because it makes them look better. And actually you don't agree with them, but you feel pressured to agree with them. Remember, it's your perspective, whether that is an agreement with him or not, or her. It's your perspective that you are sharing, not somebody else's desires and wishes for you to just go along with what they've got to say. If you're in a face-to-face meeting, obviously be aware of non-verbal communication. That's quite important, and I'm sure we're all aware of that anyway, but just look out for the cues. So some of the do's and don'ts, I'll briefly go through these because time is running through. So don't be negative, showing attitude, because it doesn't build up a rapport, which is very important on a group. You want to be respectful and respected. Talking about being politically correct, I don't want a clinician researcher to treat me as a token, as somebody who's just on the project because I happen to be a patient. And similarly, I don't want to be treating somebody else and not saying something because I just think, oh, they might get offended. So we, again, go back to respect, but also we are not just there as tokens. Don't follow your own agenda. If you've got a particular bugbear, that's not what the research is about. The research is about, again, adding your input, your good experiences, your bad experiences, but not forcing your own agenda through. And never be afraid to ask for what you need of the rest of the research group. When you start on a project, identify who the facilitator is for you. It might be the principal investigator, it might be another researcher, it might be a clinician, or it might be a fellow, somebody that you can have contact with. And always be aware that it's actually okay to say, I can't do that at the moment if you're asked to do something, because some of the things that we're asked to do can be take up quite a bit of work, and it's great if we can do them. Reviewing transcripts of focus groups takes a lot of work. It's so important. The patients are involved in that, but if you really don't have time, then you have to say, otherwise you just let people down. Any questions so far? Okay, so some suggestions. I try to be available for all the conference calls that I'm involved in and all of the meetings as much as possible. And that's partly my selfish reasons. I don't want to feel left out of the loop. And it's a bit like missing class in school. If you miss a class and you go back again, you feel as though you've missed out on something and you can't catch up. So I don't want that feeling. So I try to make every conference call or every meeting that I can, but it means that I have to pace myself. A lot of conference calls take place different times of the day or even of the night, because you're dealing with people who are in different parts of the world, different time zones. So quite often my conference calls might be at 10 o'clock at night. I need to be careful during the day so that I'm not totally exhausted by the time 10 o'clock at night comes to have an hour conference call. So that's my main motivation, but also I'm there to add my perspective. And if I'm too tired, then I can't give my perspective in that meeting. occasionally you feel a bit lost during a conference call or a meeting, always ask. I'll go back to my very early days as a patient research partner. I'd read through a particular research protocol a number of times, never been involved before. And there was one thing that kept on cropping up. And I was fortunate to be able to meet up with two of the researchers before the very first research meeting. And I simply asked, what does RCT stand for? Because in this research protocol, RCT kept on coming up time and again. And I was so new to research that I didn't know RCT meant randomized controlled trial. But it was important that I asked what seemed to be a very silly question. Otherwise, I would have been completely lost. And after that, I started to keep a list of all of the words and the terms and abbreviations that cropped up that I didn't understand. And I'd either ask in the meeting or I'd go away, and Wikipedia became my best friend for quite a while. I would look them up and I would keep my own personal note. And out of that, Martin and I, as he said before, we developed the OMERACT glossary, which relates mostly to things that are done at OMERACT, but it also has other areas of interest as well. And if you're in Canada, then there was a Canadian group who took the OMERACT glossary and then they used that as a base for one of their glossaries. And they added more sort of biomedical terms, which we don't use at OMERACT. So the glossary is actually far wider used than even on the OMERACT website. One of the things that Marika and I have done a number of times on one of our projects is we, in quite early, sort of some months ago, suggested a mini conference call with the fellows and ourselves. So we will have a chat, the two of us will have a chat with one of the fellows, and we will go through what they're trying to get through and give our opinions and perspective. And that's often easier when you've got a smaller group than the fellows asking in a big group what our opinion is. You've only got a limited time in a 1 hour call to go through what's important. So we find that really helpful, and so have the fellows, and that is then fed back in our next conference call meeting. So if you are attending, for example, a conference, whether, I don't know if you go to American College of Rheumatology, EULAR, the British Society of Rheumatology, all of the other big conferences and sometimes small conferences, you might find that researchers decide to have an ad hoc meeting. And make sure if that happens that they keep you informed about those times, because if it doesn't clash with other commitments, it's important that you're there. And if it does clash with other commitments, then say to them, please keep me informed about what was suggested or what was discussed in those ad hoc meetings.